This exploration
in Norwegen funktioniert.
was made possible by Skillshare, a community with over 25,000 classes to keep you learning. Starting in 2015, mainstream news outlets began running indignant headlines. The basic point? A criminal in Norway was living in a prison cell with far too lavish conditions. And this wasn't just any criminal. This prisoner had taken the lives of 77 people and injured over 300 more in Oslo,
Ach,
Norway's
ja, habe ich den
capital
Film erst
city,
gesehen.
and on a nearby island.
Das war
I
hart.
won't state the perpetrator's name, and I'll obscure his face in this video. Source 1 in the description has information about a memorial building for some of the victims. Suffice it to say, this was an extraordinarily dangerous prisoner, one who had caused much suffering, and one deserving of punishment. That's why news outlets ran often sarcastic and sensationalist headlines pointing out what they saw as the luxurious lifestyle he was afforded in his Norwegian prison cell. He had a treadmill, a computer, video games, a TV, and it wasn't merely one cell, but 3 attached together for extra space. And after all the scars he left on Norwegian society, and all the amenities he was provided, he and his lawyers had the audacity to claim the conditions of his sentence were violating his human rights. The
Die hat die Leute
Xbox
extra
and
richtig
daytime
angepisst.
television weren't enough. Norwegian authorities needed to do more. A lower court even agreed before being overturned on appeal. And so it's easy to see why this was a slam dunk series of headlines for editors. A terrible crime, softy European justice, and a dangerous criminal complaining in front of a judge about plasticware and cold prison coffee. But Norway's public, and many family members left
Kalter
behind,
Kaffee.
didn't call for harsher punishment. In fact, inside Norway, it continues to be standard practice to simply ignore this man and leave his handling to the professionals of the criminal justice system. Which leads us to the big question. Why? Why does Norway treat prisoners, even the worst among them, in this way? And
Ja, würde man anfangen, das abzuwägen, dann würde das irgendwann komplett außer Kontrolle geraten.
often far better. The conditions of this man's imprisonment
Hey,
opened
Elfant,
the
was
door
geht?
to a
Alles
better
fresh?
understanding of Norway's prison system, a system which can seem radically forgiving, even to those on the inside. This is the story of a nation which looks at the bigger picture, even when the world watches with exasperation. Norway's prisons are often characterized as the nicest and most humane in the world.
Es rauscht? So, ist es jetzt weg? Ist okay, rauscht immer noch? Ich brauche ein besseres neues Headset. Mein Mikrofon ist, glaube ich, kaputt gegangen. Aber jetzt, oder was? Geht immer noch nicht, rauscht immer noch. Oh. Ich hoffe, jetzt ist besser. Aber jetzt hoffe ich, dass ich mal nicht abgehackt bin. Aber jetzt. Mikrofoneinrichtung. Nee, ich bin bei meiner Freundin gerade. Deshalb habe ich PC einfach mitgenommen. Ja, sehr chillig. So, weiter geht's.
Visitors and journalists familiar with more punitive systems are usually struck by the open feel, integration with nature, and open spaces where prison staff and inmates commingle. But it hasn't always been like this. In the late 1800s, Norway's prisons followed a model of isolation, what you could call the water, bunk, and Bible method. Prisoners lived in solitary cells as a means of introspection, to contemplate their sin, and to examine their relationship with God. They would be subject to regular visits.
Hab endlich affiliate, Bruder. Muss halt Steuern angeben und darauf habe ich null Lust. Dann warte ich lieber, bis ich 18 bin. Das habe ich auch noch nicht gemacht. Ich muss auch noch ein Kleingewerbe anmelden. Das kostet irgendwie 25 Euro. Ja, ist, glaube ich, eigentlich nicht ganz so stressig. Da gehst du einfach zu deiner Stadt. Dann geht das schon.
Visits from a priest for discussions of the soul, and their religious knowledge would be measured upon admittance and
Ich
release.
Stalker.
While ineffective,
mal
the
follow,
Lutheran brand
weil
of
ich ihn nicht
justice
gefollowt hab.
planted some seeds for the future. First, because crime was seen as sin, and sin was a shared vice of all humans, the inmates were not seen as separate from society at large. Rather, they were souls in need of redemption. Second, daily visitations and regular contact with clergy made priests a sort of rudimentary social worker. The first half of the 20th century saw major shifts in the conditions and infrastructure of prison life in Norway. The first prison colonies, camp-like shared facilities, appeared in 1912. Church attendance was no longer compulsory, and prison staff started looking at mental health rather than inmate piety. But the mindset of the system was still punitive. Inmates were seen as deficient.
Ah, ich habe gar keinen deutschen Untertitel an, fällt mir gerade auf. Ups. Geht ja alles schief heute da. Automatischer Zeugen. Fällt mir jetzt erst auf.
Citizens, and their rights were curtailed accordingly. A couple things started to change this mindset. The first was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. Its first article read, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." While most nations dismissed the declaration as unenforceable, it was taken seriously in Norway over the next 70 years.
Ja, sonst alles fresh, ne? Bisschen stressig. Nachher noch einen dicken Schrank aufbauen und auch die Schwiegereltern in Spee besuchen und so. Ja, sonst alt fresh. Ich bin nur ein bisschen faul, ne? Muss ein bisschen mehr streamen, müssen mehr Reaction-Content machen, ein paar Sachen hochladen, nicht nur immer Multiplayer-Games zocken, aber ansonsten alles fresh. Wie sieht's bei dir aus?
And with that in the background, a more radical series of groups in Scandinavia sought the abolition of prison generally. In the 60s, in Sweden, the National Swedish
Du musst Arbeit finden. Was hast du denn gelernt?
Association for Penal Reform, or KRUM. In Denmark, it was the Association for Humane Penal Policy, KRIM, and in Norway, it was the Norwegian Association for Penal Reform, KROM. KRUM, KRIM, and KROM sought short-term goals of ending
KRUM,
pretrial
KRIM, and KROM.
detention, ending the imprisonment of minors, and ending the control of posts sent in and out of.
Wieso wollen die dich nicht? Wie stellst du dich denn vor? Du musst ein paar Videos gucken. Du musst sagen, ja, können Sie sich das vorstellen? Ja, weiß ich nicht. Einfach selbstbewusst reingehen, vielleicht ein paar Lügen und dann geht das schon klar. Einfach überall bewerben. Überall. Nicht hier bei Twitch sitzen oder streamen. Überall bewerben. Überall. Christa Mignon.
Prison. The reform movement also placed the concept of prison normalization on the table. Inmates weren't deficient, said the reformers. They were equal parts of society, temporarily removed, yet destined to return to the outside world. Therefore, they were equal in dignity and rights, just like those outside the prison walls. But it wasn't until decades later that elected officials began to take action on these principles. Saddled with increasing incarceration rates in the 80s and 90s, the government published a series of white papers proposing a major overhaul of the prison system. The first, in 1997, was called A Paradigm Shift, and proposed changes for prison staff. Guards were not only there for security, like digging through prisoner cells or breaking up fights, they were social workers as well, educated with a 2-year specialized degree in law,
Nice,
human
richtig
rights,
gut.
criminology, psychology, and ethics.
Alter,
Their role wasn't
geile
only
Ausbildung.
to make sure prisoners served time for crime, but also for preventing future crime, lowering the recidivism rate, the percentage of inmates who reoffend after finishing their sentence. Like the priests in the 1800s caring for the future of the soul, The guard social worker hybrid would care for the future of the person. And like the priests who saw prisoners as just another sinner among many, the government was moving towards seeing prisoners as just another human being among many. A 2008 white paper entitled Punishment That Works, Less Crime, Safer Society went further. The entire purpose of the prison system, it claimed, was the rehabilitation and reintegration of inmates. The government was now using the language of reform, calling for a principle of normality that would punish criminals with the restriction of liberty, but absolutely nothing more. No inmate would live in conditions more restricted than necessary for the good of wider society.
Bei Netto. Uff, uff. Ja, Digga, dann, wie man's macht, ne? Du guckst, was du vielleicht falsch gemacht hast und machst es bei der nächsten Bewerbung anders. Immer irgendwas anders machen, besser machen. Vielleicht ist deine Ausstrahlung, vielleicht warst du nicht höflich oder deine Aussprache, vielleicht sahst du ungepflegt aus. Ich weiß nicht, das können so viele Sachen sein. Oder die wollen jetzt nicht so einen Typen wie du oder du hast ihn nicht so motiviert gewirkt oder vielleicht haben die auch schon Leute eingestellt. Schreib überall Bewerbungen hin. Man verfehlt 100% der Schüsse, die man nicht macht. Lieber in alle Richtungen, wie eine Pumpgun. Irgendwer sagt ja.
And life in prison would resemble life outside prison as much as possible. The Norwegian prison system of today is a culmination of these 150 years of reform. Norway's incarceration rate is 72 people out of every 100,000 in the population.
Das geht klar.
That's roughly a tenth of the US rate, which imprisons 716
Das ist
for every
krass,
100,000.
Zehntel weniger.
There is a total of around 3,500
Zehntel
prisoners in Norway, spread over 64 prisons. If you're doing the math, that's only about 50 prisoners per prison. Norway's correctional service keeps this number low so that inmate family and friends can easily visit, believing this assists reintegration into society. In contrast to American prisons, which typically use a static security system with guards centralized inside wings of cells, a typical Norwegian prison is dynamic, laid out more like a campus. Rather than efficiency, the purpose is normalization. Prisoners commute, so to speak, from activity to activity. Cooking, haircut, religious services, visitation, recreation. The idea is to feel as much like everyday life as possible. And there are as many prison staffers as inmates.
Oh,
Across the
1
system,
zu
the
1 Betreuung.
staff-to-prisoner ratio is roughly 1-to-1, assuring that each incarcerated person has a main contact in the prison staff to help with addiction problems, career development, counseling, conflict management, and stress management. Rather than hunkering down in a guard booth, staff are required to commingle with the inmates to develop personal relationships. The Norwegians have found that
Gibt
these
wahrscheinlich auch gut Geld.
interactions, more than any other measure, help to keep all inmates and staff safe and secure. Inmates receive assistance finding work and are entitled to the full income from their labor. If they had a job before their conviction, they often continue to attend with regular leave from prison.
Digga, mein Plan für dich wäre jetzt, du guckst erstmal jetzt 10 Videos über Bewerbung, suchst die Artikel raus, was du hättest falsch machen können, dann schreibst du eine richtig geile Bewerbung und dann schickst du die auf alles, was du annähernd Bock hast oder auch nicht Bock hast. Autowerkstatt, Verkäufer, Aldi, Lidl, Netto, Fressnapf, Real, Kaufland, Tierarztpraxis, einfach in alle Richtungen. Erst das machen und dann guckst du genau und dann schickst du die Bewerbung einfach überall hin. Und wenn du E-Mail schreibst, dann mach die auch richtig formell wie ein Brief. Hol dir schönes Papier, hol dir schöne Briefumschläge und den einen Tipp, den ich noch im Kopf habe, ist herauszufinden, wer denn dafür verantwortlich ist, die Leute einzustellen. Nicht immer dieses liebe Damen, meine Damen und Herren, sondern genau die Person im Brief ansprechen. Ein bisschen direkter.
If unqualified for work in a field, they have a right to an education. And rather than a diploma with a prison name on it, inmates receive accreditation from a local institution. Prisoners are entitled to regular phone calls and visitation with family. There's no glass walls like in the movies, and inmates and their loved ones get private rooms. If prisoners have children, they can apply for additional visitation time. Cells in Norway's prisons are more like mini apartments. It's normal for inmates to have a private bath and a mini fridge, common spaces for activities like music and art, fully equipped kitchens, sharp knives and all to practice culinary skills, outdoor spaces to explore and relax, spots for fishing, sunbathing, sports, and other recreation. In most prisons, inmates can move freely and even have the key to their own room. The principles of rehabilitation and normalization put into practice create something completely different in Norwegian
Der hat auch
corrections.
eine Brust links,
Every
ja.
American journalist who visits has remarked in their article, without fail, that Norway's prisons left them doubting whether they were prisons at all. Of course they are. The incarcerated's freedom of movement has been restricted, and in Norway that's considered sufficient. But let's be honest, this leaves a lot of people questioning whether justice is being served. Many might accept the idea of a common criminal living in relaxed prison conditions, but what about violent inmates? Why should a man whose victims number in the hundreds be afforded a computer, treadmill, and television? And the most common answer to this objection is the results. Norway expends around $90,000 per inmate, triple that of the United States. But for this elevated cost and focus on reintegration, they enjoy the lowest recidivism rate in Scandinavia and the wider Western world. Only 20% reoffend and go back to prison after their release.
Ein Fünftel.
For comparison, the recidivism rate in the United States is roughly 68%.
Ach du Scheiße, das ist ein krasser Kontrast.
But the tactics, they say, stop people from committing more crime. And Norwegians can put it in more individualistic terms too. It's a good neighbor policy. The vast majority of those who go to prison will re-emerge again into society. Who would you rather have as a neighbor? Someone who's been through a punitive system and harshly punished? Or someone who's encountered restorative social work and normalizing conditions?
Willst du den normalen bei
If
dir
you'd
haben?
rather have a rehabilitated neighbor, the argument goes, congratulations, you found a selfish reason to support a humane prison system. And that's usually where most analysis ends. A journalist tacks on a fawning headline about the humanity of the system. The Norwegian Correctional Services links to a study about their low recidivism rate on their website, and Law and Order types roll their eyes. But a deeper analysis calls into question the rosiness of the picture. There's a glaring problem when comparing the recidivism rate, the rate of reoffenders, between the US and Norway. That's because they aren't measured the same way. In fact, there's no standard metric or definition for reporting the percentage of criminals who go on to reoffend. How many years after release is recidivism measured? Are all convicted criminals counted, or only ones who have spent time in an actual prison? What crimes are societies
Willst du
in prison
Fachleiter
known
machen?
for? Is the measurement done on a local, state, or national level? Do parole violations count as recidivism? These variables alone could cause
Bei der Polizei kannst du dich bewerben. Das gibt auch gut regelmäßig Geld. Da lernst du was. Bundeswehr kannst du auch machen. Das zeigt dir ein bisschen, also Zivildienst, irgendwas. Ich würde sagen, Digga, schreib 80, 100 Bewerbungen. Alles, in jede Richtung. Guck dir alles an. Ja, was nicht ist, kann noch werden, Digga. Mein Schwager in Spee, also der Freund von meiner Schwester, der hat sich einfach vorbereitet. Er hat gesagt, okay, sie kommen zum Einstellungstest. Der war auch nicht ganz so krass sportlich. Der hat ein bisschen, also ist ein Kopf größer als ich und ein bisschen breiter. Da hat er einfach angefangen zu joggen. Klein angefangen und so. Der ist jetzt richtig sportlich und er ist jetzt gerade Probezeit bei der Polizei. Und ist jetzt schon halb verbeamtet und es sieht sehr, 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 sehr gut aus. Er hat jetzt bald nochmal eine Prüfung, aber er bereitet sich vor. Du, was nicht ist, kann noch werden. Der hat sich da einfach gesagt, ey, ich gehe jetzt einfach joggen. Hat sich Pokémon Go angemacht, Dingsbums, Musik in die Ohren. Erst 1 Kilometer, 2 und jetzt macht er immer so, dass er irgendwie alle 2-3 Tage einfach seine 10 Kilometer ganz entspannt joggt, kriegt die Kilos runter, wird sportlicher, ist schön geil durch den Sporttest durch, du. Das geht alles. Geht alles.
consistent numbers. For our case, the U.S. bases the number on the percentage of freed inmates who are rearrested. Norway bases the number on the percentage of freed inmates who are
Du kannst dich auch nochmal hinsetzen und Fachgymnasium machen. Ich weiß nicht, was für einen Abschluss du hast. Ich gehe mal von Realschule aus. Kannst du noch ein Fachgymnasium Abschluss hinten ran machen. Und dann ist das Feld von den Arbeiten, die du machen kannst, ein bisschen größer, ist die Bezahlung besser. EBR. Was ist denn EBR? Muss ich mal kurz googeln. EBR. EBR Projektentwicklung GmbH. Mittlere Reife. Realschule. Ja, wenn du willst, ich habe, als ich krank geworden bin und noch nicht wusste, was ich gemacht habe, was ich machen wollte, habe ich gesagt, ich mache jetzt einfach mein Hochschulabschluss nach, Gymnasium, und habe mir dann eine Fachgymnasium gesucht und bin dann da rein mit Richtung Gesundheit und Soziales. Das gibt es natürlich auch noch mit BWL. Das kann ich dir auch empfehlen. Weil du bist jetzt wahrscheinlich ein bisschen älter und du hättest in der Schule wahrscheinlich ein bisschen mehr machen können. Der Abschluss hätte noch ein bisschen besser sein können, so wie das eigentlich fast bei vielen ist, wenn man sich nicht so angestrengt hat, so wie es bei mir ist. Äh, Obwohl man hätte mehr machen können, könntest du da nochmal richtig reinhelfen. Da hast du 3 Jahre, um nochmal deinen inneren Schweinehund richtig zu peitschen.
Incarcerated. So the statistics represent totally different things. If you compare the USA and Norway on the same basis, on the percentage of freed inmates who are reincarcerated, they're not that far apart. Norway roughly 25%, the US roughly 27 to 29%. And if we look at the rearrest rate, Norway approaches 50% compared to the US's 68%. Norway still ranks better on both metrics, but the difference narrows. I've cited 2 sources below that detail this further. The point is, upon further examination of the data, we neither find a robust statistical endorsement of treating prisoners better, nor even a conclusive prosecution of America's punitive system. Instead, we find a measurable, modest difference with a lot of ambiguity mixed in. So if we want to truly understand Norway's prison system, we can't just lean on flashy numbers. We need to ask what the end of the justice system is. In the US, imprisonment is often about justice for individual victims. The end of an American prison is retribution for acts committed against people or the state. It's individuals held accountable to individuals through the system. In Norway, imprisonment seems to be about justice for society as a whole. Justice is distributive and relative to its holistic effect on all people in the
Das ist
country.
richtig schlau.
Prisoner treatment is not about the satisfaction of grievance, but rather an assessment of how a convicted individual can best reintegrate into the larger social welfare community, not just for their sake, but for everyone's. To treat even undeniably bad people in accordance with their values, Norway is carrying out a conviction that human rights are a catalyst rather than a hindrance to justice. Taken one step further, human rights are justice. Part of reintegrating into society is learning how to contribute. That's why Norwegian prisons have top-notch educational resources. But you don't need to commit a crime to get top-notch education
Ja, jetzt kommt wieder Werbung,
anytime,
ne?
all around the world. Whether
Skillshare.
it's storytelling,
Skillshare ist überall bei den
animation,
ganzen Videos, die
design,
ich gucke.
photography, or
Ich
starting a
erkenne einen
business,
Zusammenhang.
Skillshare has more than 25,000 classes to get you started in the
So, Elfant, ich hoffe, du hast einige meiner Worte vernommen und denkst drüber nach. Ich würde mich auf jeden Fall sehr freuen, wenn du dir mehr Mühe machst, ein besserer Mensch wirst und deinen eigenen Schweinehund richtig in die Fresse haust. Dann kriegst du das hin. Und im Vorher weiß man nie, ob man irgendwas kann. Einfach anfangen zu machen. Wenn du sagst, du bist jetzt unsportlich, einfach, wenn du ein Ziel vor Augen hast, kriegst du das alles hin. Und auf dem Weg dahin wirkt das immer leichter und nicht so schwierig, wie man sich das am Anfang immer gedacht hat. Das ist alles sehr viel einfacher, als wie man sich es im Kopf zurechtbaut. So, ich bin dann erstmal raus. Mach nicht mehr so doll. Immer schützen. Glas Wasser trinken nicht vergessen.